the role of a writer? Does it have any political effect? Can it change lives?
The role of a writer, I think, is to inspire people to search for the truth. Now, as to whether it has a political effect, I think yes, but to a very limited extent. Because as you know, people are so distracted these days. There are so many competing demands on their attention. But despite that limitation, I think that writers and writing do have the potential to change lives. For instance, they can inspire people to be more alert, to be more in tune with their senses. They can inspire people to be more sensitive to what's going on around them. So it can change lives, siguro at the individual level, one at a time. But in terms of societal change, I think that would have to be limited to a society where a cataclysmic event has occurred. So I'm thinking in terms of Rizal when he wrote The Noli and the Fili. But despite these limitations, it's still possible for writers to cause changes in how people live their individual lives.
Can you talk about beginnings? How did you begin in writing?
I began writing journalism when I was 19, so I've been writing for more than 16 years now. But fiction I began writing only when I was 27, so I'm practically a beginner in terms of fiction. So what got me started was, I think, my father, because he also published some short stories when he was in his mid-40s and onwards. So I think that's primarily it. It was the combined influence of my father's writing and my mother's voracious reading habits.
What effect, if any, does a writer have in a society?
To the extent that a writer can provoke reflection, to the extent that a writer can encourage people to think about the events that are happening around them, then I think the writer is able to inspire some form of action also on the part of the individual reader.
Which reason of becoming a writer that you'd love the most?
I would have to be honest and say that whatever the reason is, it has nothing to do with money, because writing does not pay very well in the Philippines. So it is more out of a need to make sense of what was going on around me. So reflection led and continues to lead to writing, and it helps me restore some peace of mind to my daily routine.
What is inspiration?
Inspiration is the spark that gets me to think and to write. And most often it comes in the form of family memories. So it could be anything from an interesting conversation to a new word that my 3-year-old nephew has learned, to a particularly warm and relaxing family dinner. So when I was a little bit younger, inspiration was more flighty. It was the sight of a particular face or conversations with friends and loved ones. But now that I'm older, I find that much of my inspiration comes from my relations with my family.
What are your usual subjects?
My usual subjects would have to be family relations. In particular, I like to look at how large events in society and in history affect individual lives. I'm a big fan of the writers Ian McEwan and Salman Rushdie, and both of them have the same literary project, I think, which is to examine how people's lives are changed by events that are almost out of their control.
How does poetry and fiction differ?
I must confess I don't read poetry as much as I read fiction, but from what I've studied, I've noticed that the demands of writing poetry are much, much higher. There are, for example, the conventions of meter and rhyme, and you are challenged to come up with so many large truths while using only the most minimal number of words possible. So those of us who write fiction have the luxury of being able to craft longer sentences, longer paragraphs. So in a sense, poetry requires a greater amount of discipline than fiction.
How do you find the words that describe your poems and stories?
I try not to describe my work too much. What I do is I set a goal with every project. For instance, for one short story, I tell myself I'd like to explore this particular facet of family relations. And when the work is done, then I leave it to the reader to decide how to describe it. So it's up to the reader to judge whether the work has succeeded or not. But for me, once the project is done, then I move on to the next one. I think that's the only way growth can be possible for a writer. Not to linger too much, not to wallow too much in the praise that you get or the criticisms that you get for whatever it is that you've written.